Is this the year the Buffalo Sabres finally make the playoffs? We have the latest update on Gabriel Landeskog for the Avalanche. And can the Edmonton Oilers get back to the Stanley Cup Finals and win it? Do they have enough depth on defense? We've got all that and a whole lot more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Sabres, Joe DiBiase. And Joe, an exciting time for the Sabres right now. Talk to me about the ramifications of starting this season off in Germany.
So it's a little unique. I mean, they just played an exhibition game against Red Bull Munich, and a German team with a couple of former NHL players and a couple of prospect guys, but certainly a team that you're not really getting NHL caliber reps against, but still kind of a cool experience. You get some ice time over there before the season got rolling. I think really the biggest ramification and the biggest curiosity, uniqueness to going overseas like this is NHL training camps are short. It's not like football where you have 2 months of buildup sometimes before the start of a season. The Sabres showed up to training camp like a week ago, and it was, all right, we got 5 days until we're on a plane heading for Germany. So honestly, the biggest ramifications might have been there were young players that could have had an opportunity to make this NHL team that really didn't, because Lindy Ruff had to show up and basically say, all right, all our NHL guys are practicing over here, all our AHL guys are practicing over here, and there really was no intermingling. Then they left, and some of their lower level prospect guys that could have surprised didn't really get a shot. But otherwise, a lot of team building, I'm sure. I saw some pictures of the squad going over to Oktoberfest today. So as long as they don't have too much fun, I think the team building exercise is the big value there.
No question about that. And then how does it affect the schedule after you come back from Europe?
That's probably the biggest thing, honestly. Like Lindy Ruff talked about that a little bit too, that it's not really as big a thought when you think of, oh, you're going overseas and how your training camp's conducted and, you know, the atmosphere of the game is an impact. But really the biggest impact on your season might be you're flying back from Europe and getting readjusted to the time zones. So the NHL did at least those teams a favor, the Sabres, the Devils, of giving them a 4 or 5 day break between that day and then a couple of home games at the start, so you don't have to go right back out on the road when you get back. So we'll have to see how big an impact it really has on them, but I do think that 4 or 5 day stretch with home games at the start should help insulate their return a little bit, but it's something to watch for sure.
Now, there's also a new captain in Buffalo. Talk to me about that and what it means for this team.
Yeah, so Rasmus Dahlin is named the captain of this hockey team, and around here, that was not a big surprise. I think we were all just kind of waiting to see when they would announce that. And then 4 alternates to go along with them. Really, the team getting turned over to this young core that, hey, so far they've disappointed, but a lot of these guys have developed individually really well. They're ready to take the team over. Dahlin is a vocal leader at this point. Dahlin is, to me, one of those guys that I didn't really expect this when they drafted him. When they drafted him, he was a 6'2", pretty thin, not very physical, one-dimensional offensive defenseman that you thought could grow into a lot of elements in his offensive game and his defensive game. That's how he showed up. 5 years later, he is as well-rounded as it gets. This guy's worked on his shot, which was a problem coming in. He has become... Go look up a montage of Rasmus Dahlin hits. He's got some of the biggest bone-crushing hits in the league in the last couple of years, and I would have never predicted that would have been a part of his game. Dahlin is the first guy. There was a play last year where Dylan Cousins, or it was Tage Thompson, got run along the wall. Who's the guy that went in after TJ Oshie? on the Washington Capitals. It was Rasmus Dahlin. He is the guy that will stick up for teammates. He'll deliver the checks. He'll set the tone physically. He's also probably their best all-around player. So I think it says a lot about how Dahlin has grown because it wasn't all roses. A couple years in, it looked like there could be a problem. That maybe even the word bust would get thrown around. And from really year 2, when that was happening, to now, he's grown in every single element of his game and as a leader.
Obviously, the Sabres have missed the playoffs the last few years, and they've been one of those teams that a lot of people said, oh, this is the year. This is the year they get over the hump, get back to the playoffs. They've got some young talent. What are your biggest concerns and biggest reasons for optimism heading into this new season?
Yeah, Gail, I think I said 6 times that hell, this will be the year that they do it. Really, the way it works, I think one of those years where you don't expect them to make it is when it's going to happen. And maybe that's this year a little bit. I think the expectation is that they'll probably fall a little bit short, but they'll be a team that's on the bubble. They'll be competitive. Would it be a major shock if they found their way into a wild card spot? I don't think so. If they found their way to a top 3 position in this division with Toronto and Florida and Boston and Tampa, I mean, that would be a wow. But what I think holds them back from being in that company of those 4 elite teams in the division right now is I don't really trust the goal scoring. It's been different in the past. There have been other years where, oh man, I don't know about their goaltending or their blue line looks really tough. Right now, the goaltending looks great. The Jukka-Pekka Luukkonen showed up as a number 1. Devin Levi actually had a great year of development. He was a little up and down in the NHL in 20-some games last year, but then he went down to Rochester as a 21-year-old, first year of pro hockey, and was second in the AHL in save percentage. I think that's a pretty good year of development, and he's your number 2, so that's hopeful. Your blue line is pretty loaded at this point, but all of a sudden, the team that was number 3 in the league in goals 2 years ago doesn't have a 60-point third-line center anymore in Casey Middlestat. They don't have a 25 to 35 goal scorer on the wing in Jeff Skinner. They don't have, 2 years ago, they had a 28 goal scorer on the third line in Victor Olofsson. And they've replaced those guys with, I think, decent hockey players, but what have they replaced them with? Responsible two-way defensive players. That's okay. It's the way they want to play, a little bit more hard-nosed, responsible in your own end. But what I'm worried that they have sacrificed a little bit too much is the goal scoring. If they don't get Tage Thompson, Dylan Cousins, and JJ Peterka, Jack Quinn to really carry the load at the top, I think they're going to have a big problem putting goals in the back of the net this year.
Can the power play make up for some of the lack of scoring depth 5-on-5?
I'm optimistic of that. They were a bad power play team last year, no doubt about it. But I think a lot of it was coaching from their assistant coach, Matt Ellis. It was just such a dry power play. All 5 guys go stand in your spot and we'll pass it around and hope somebody comes open. No movement, no fluidity at all to the power play. And they've completely changed that. Everyone's moving around. They're cycling. And I do think that they have a better system in place for their power play. I think Jeff Skinner, he was a great 5-on-5 goal scorer. This has actually been his whole career. Great 5-on-5 scorer, has never been good on the power play. And the Sabres asked him to play in the top power play unit last year. Now he's gone, and JJ Peterka's on that top unit. I think that will help as well. Bo Byram having another good quarterback for a full season on the second unit, I think will help. So I'm glad you mentioned the power play, because that is the one thing where, you know what, that might work. That equation might work where, all right, you're middle of the pack to even below average when it comes to 5-on-5 scoring, but your power play figures it out, then you could have enough to actually make the playoffs.
Do you have one player who may surprise some people that maybe casual fans are not aware of heading into the season?
The guy I'd want to say, I don't know how off the radar he would be for everybody, but watch out for Zach Benson. Like, Zach Benson, again, he's not a no-name. He was a first-round pick, and he made some headlines when he made the team last year. How often does a player not picked in the top 10 make his team out of his first training camp? Usually that's reserved for the first picks, the second picks. Very, very rarely do you see a 13th pick do that. And what's strange about Benson doing it is what's most common when a guy at 18 makes a team, I think, is, oh, he must be producing offensively. 5'9", right? Like 160. He's a small player. Oh, he must have been lighting the lamp. What's funny is Benson actually didn't produce a lot of offense last year. He was not that dangerous. amazing to me, he made the team based on his maturity as a player, his hockey sense, his two-way game. He was playing. You didn't see Zach Benson on the power play last year. You don't want to know where he saw him all year long? The penalty kill. So to me, it's a good sign that he kind of made the team and stuck all year because he was giving them that two-way game that you usually are working to get out of an 18-year-old. Now you're seeing the skating got a little bit better. He put on a little bit more muscle. I think you're seeing him starting to thrive a little bit more with the offensive game, which is why he got drafted 13th overall. And I think marrying his offensive nature that wasn't able to come out last year, just because I don't think he was physically up to it, with his hockey IQ, which to me is it's off the charts. It's going to be a thing about him for the next 5 to 10 years in the NHL, is how smart a player he is. You combine those two things, there's right now he's on their second line. It was going to be a battle between him and Jason Zucker to be in that top 6, and from like the second practice on, it's been all Zach Benson, and he hasn't moved off it. So yeah, keep an eye on Benson. You could absolutely see a breakout season for him, even though he's still only 19 years old.
Joe, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Absolutely. You can find me Locked On Sabres wherever you're listening to this podcast, whatever feed. You can find me on YouTube as well, and then on Twitter at Sneaky Joe Sports. If you can manage some hot Bills takes along the way with my Sabres coverage too.
All right, Joe. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. My favorite feature on the Game Time app remains the view from your seat. When you sign into the app, you could see a panoramic view from your seat before you buy the tickets, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Just download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Avalanche, Shaggy Von Doom himself, Kyle Sullivan. And Kyle, training camp underway for the Avalanche, and always high expectations for this team. But again, it seems like no captain right now. What is the latest on Gabriel Landeskog's situation?
Gabe Landeskog, the man, the myth, the legend, he is around. He's in the locker room. He's skating in practice. He's making hockey-related moves. If you would have asked this question to my co-host Chris Maselli over on Locked On Avs, he has been the eternal optimist for Gabe Landeskog's return. Me, however, I am the doom part of my Shaggy Von Doom moniker. I have anticipated his retirement since the injury. It's a rough one to come back from. Literally reconstructing your knee in experimental surgery. It's a lot to ask to come back to NHL action, and he hasn't been on the ice since the 2022 Cup. But this looks like a if, and like the if is kind of addressed. The when is what we're looking at, and it looks like maybe late October, early November for his return. And even though Gabe Landeskog has not been the captain on the ice, the example he has set has kind of leaked to like Devon Toews, who is taking time to work with rookie defensemen and the new faces just to, he knows Cale Makar, and that's his partner in crime, but he wants to work with the new faces in the Avalanche organization. So Landeskog's leadership ability, where Landeskog went and picked up Ben Myers from the airport when he made his Avalanche debut a couple years ago, it's kind of trickled down to the players that are still there that were under Gabe's captaincy.
If he does come back, let's say late October, early November, how do they fit him into the lineup? Where does he play, and how much does he play at first?
That's a wonderful question. And this is honestly, with all the power that's in the front office of the Avalanche, Jared Bednar behind the bench, this solely relies on Gabe Landeskog. He will dictate what he feels like he can do. You can expect him. He's not going to be on that top line right off the bat. I would expect him to be on that second or third line, just getting a feel for NHL action. You can simulate it all day long, but when you're in regular season NHL action, you've got to really acclimate yourself. Maybe a 10-minute kind of time on ice for that first game, maybe up to 15. But if he feels good enough, he can log 20 minutes, but it's all going to be that knee. And we're going to go from counting down the days from his return to seeing how long he could stay out there, because that's what's going to be the conversation every time he takes the ice from this point forward.
And is it going to be like, will they play him every other game initially and try to see how the knee responds? Or do you think he comes back an everyday player right away?
That's, again, it's what nobody really knows with this type experimental injury. I believe it was LaMelo Ball had this same surgery in the NBA, and he's still going through it and trying to figure it out. Gabe Landeskog is going to have to figure out, it's going to be shift by shift for the rest of his career on what can hold up and what can he do. You could be the healthiest player ever and take one bad edge, and that's it. So you are in a heightened awareness for this situation around Gabe, but he knows what he's going to do. He's been working to get back here, and he's going to be working to stay on the ice, but it's shift by shift for Gabe Landeskog.
How does all this uncertainty affect the overall atmosphere around the team?
Well, it didn't affect them much last year because they're getting kind of used to it. And now with his eventual return, it's something to look forward to, but it's business as usual. There's been a lot of times since the last time the Avalanche raised the cup over their head, and they need to get back there. It's every season from this point forward when you have players like Cale Makar, Nathan MacKinnon, Mikko Rantanen, it's cup or bust. You have some of the best players in the league right now, and I'm not saying that with burgundy and blue glasses. Cale Makar is changing the position, and Nathan MacKinnon has finally walked away last season with the hardware he deserves. So they have targets on their back, and they carry that Avalanche swagger where about a decade ago they did not have that. So they need to go out there and make a statement. They were knocked out 2 years ago by Seattle in the first round, Dallas last year in the second. They need to keep climbing to get back where they deserve.
Talk to me a little bit about some of the new faces and maybe some prospects who may have a chance to have an impact this year.
We have to start with the hot name this offseason through camp and practices, and that'd be Callum Ritchie. He has really impressed a lot of people with how he handles himself on the ice. He has stood out, and what you see him in the preseason games so far, he's really making a loud case for making his way into this roster. If it's going to be the third line, maybe sometime on that fourth, but that's not really where he deserves to be. Maybe that third. But throughout the preseason, Nikolai Kovalenko, the big name from last year when he joined the Avalanche team from his time in the KHL, he has really played amazing in this preseason so far. In the second game against Dallas, he really turned some heads where Dallas was fielding a lot of their everyday roster. The Avs were still fielding just prospects. And Kovalenko was really impressive. And we want to see him continue to build on this throughout the rest of the preseason. But he was a name that saw some minutes last year, and he wants to keep those minutes going into this season.
What's the biggest difference in his game compared to last year?
It feels like he has that whole season through in the organization, some comfortable kind of familiarity with everybody on the line, what's expected of him, and the speed of the NHL game and the size of the rink. That's always the big thing when you come across the ocean to play in the NHL, is adjusting to that speed and size of the game. And it feels like he is more comfortable in his game and what's being asked of him. And it feels like he is settling into that role and can really take that step up. But you want to see that on display, not in a preseason simulated situation, but with NHL action.
So the season is coming up fast. We're just a couple of weeks away. What is the biggest reason for optimism in Colorado now, and what's the biggest cause for concern?
Biggest reason of optimism would have to be the core of this Avalanche team. That window's wide open, and you have Casey Middlestat as your secured. And yeah, mark this down. The Avalanche have a 2C, where they have not in quite some time, since Nazem Kadri. So it has been a long time since they had an established 2C, and they could really build some depth that way. You're really optimistic for the core, but you're a little pessimistic and concerned when it comes to what you're going to get out of the new faces, because last year you had Ryan Johansson come in here, Tomas Tatar, and both did not make it to the trade deadline. And you want to see what Miles Wood can do in year 2, and Ross Colton. Ross Colton was rumored to be traded out before free agency, but he's still a member of the Avalanche. So you want to see what year 2 does for both of them. If Casey Middlestat does pan out, he had a great, since coming over at the trade deadline, he had a great remainder of the season and playoffs. We want to see him build on that. But the goalie position is always going to be the big question in Colorado. And how long do they hold on to Georgiev this year?
So how do you see it playing out in goal?
Me and my co-host Chris Maselli had this conversation and this agreement, which is rare on the show, where we both said he could have a Vezina quality year or he could have the worst year of his career, but this will probably be the last year for Alexander Georgiev in Colorado because he will be demanding money. And after the kind of the shaky tenure that he's had in Colorado, I don't think the Avs want to sign back up for another round of this. They can go out and find another goalie. So they're not going to overpay for what Georgiev has given so far, and they don't want to commit to the inadequacies, especially when going out and drafting a stellar goalie out of the KHL in Nabokov, and they have Justus Annunen backing up Georgiev, who's going to be splitting time, and you're going to see a 1A, 1B, ideally, situation this year, and you want to see what Justus, if he could step up, because many say that he can.
We shall see. I know you'll have the pulse of covered all season long. Kyle, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
You can find us. Just search Locked On Avalanche on YouTube. We pop right up. Subscribe while you're there. And anywhere you get your podcasts, look up that same name. We'll be right there each and every day. You can find me on social media. Just search Shaggy Von Doom.
All right. Kyle, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Oh, it's an honor, my friend.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you could start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you could check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet, and there's so much to check out right now on FanDuel. Baseball playoffs starting up this week. You've got pro and college football in full swing. Hockey preseason underway. Hockey futures all out there for you to bet on. So check out all the latest odds. Again, that's $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Go to FanDuel.com. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Oilers, Nick Zararis. And Nick, lots going on in Edmonton right now. Let's start with the injury news. Some key injuries already, and we haven't even gotten through the preseason yet.
Yeah, Evander Kane dealt with a nagging lower body injury most of the playoffs. It knocked him out of, I want to say, midway through the conference final and the entirety of the actual cup final. Weirdly waited the entire summer to rectify whether or not he was going to do surgery or try and rehab his way back into the game, but he had surgery last week. The early estimates are January to begin hockey activities, and you'd imagine a 2 or 3 week ramp up period to get him ready, but that's a long ways down the road. Darnell Nurse is dealing with a nagging lower body injury. That's also from last year's playoffs, but didn't rise to the threshold or degree really to need surgery, so he's going to try and play with that. Leon Draisaitl had offseason surgery to deal with a lower body injury as well. You know, you go on one of those long cup final runs, that's a lot of miles, then it starts to add up. And even if you can play, it doesn't necessarily mean you're healthy or 100%. So it's going to be really important for the Oilers to find a way to maintain that, because they didn't lose a lot of games last year. And historically, we know if a team has good injury luck the following season, that typically isn't the case.
So how do you deal with some of these injuries? How do you replace the production of Evander Kane? Let's start with that.
So the logic is that they're going to recreate it in the aggregate. They bring in Skinner, they bring in Arvidsson, they push guys who were playing higher in the lineup, down the lineup, and it lengthens out the lineup. You know, Kane, 20 some odd goals pretty consistently every year, good net front guy, but he's not on power play 1. He doesn't kill penalties. So recreating those minutes, and it looks like, at least to start the year, the minutes that Kane was getting are going to go to Jeff Skinner, but it's a long season and minutes and priorities, who gels well with who changes. The Oilers have options for the first time in quite a while where they can play Ryan Nugent-Hopkins on first line on a left wing. They can play him on the second line on the left wing, or play him in the middle and move Draisaitl outside. He could play on the third line on the wing or center with Adam Henrique as well. And when you have a player like Nuge who's able to kind of play a little of everything because he's so versatile skill set wise, it opens things up. And that'll be the key for the Oilers this year, is even though, and we're going to talk about the new guys in a minute, that's kind of the key to integrating all of these new pieces, is finding out what the most optimal combinations are.
Do you think the team would be better off to have, let's say, Darnell Nurse sit out a few games early in the season and get healthier, or does it make more sense for him to try to play through it?
That's a great question. In all honesty, I've always of the opinion you get it cleaned up, because the longer you let it linger, it gets worse. We see this all the time where you have a nagging injury that's not serious enough to keep you out, but because of that injury, you're moving a little bit differently. Your body starts to overcompensate for it, and it makes you more susceptible to other injuries. You know, I was talking yesterday with somebody about Christian McCaffrey, who I and him both unfortunately have in fantasy, he had a calf injury, and because of that, it started to impact his Achilles, how he was walking, and that's a much more serious injury. And that's kind of the case here. You know, if it's a pull, whatever, but based on the fact that they went the entire offseason, they didn't do surgery, it leads me to believe he's going to be okay to play. But at a certain point, you do worry about that long term, because he is on the team for at least another 6 seasons after this year, and you don't want that nagging lower body injury to become something more serious.
And also, it's better to have him healthy come, April, May,
Yes.
hopefully June, than it is in October.
Yes, 100%. And that's really important. The Oilers got very lucky injuries-wise in the playoffs, where the only player who ended up missing significant time was Evander Kane. Adam Henrique missed, I want to say, 9 of the 25 playoff games, but he was still able to play a decent chunk of them. Whereas Kane, it was really clear, especially in that Vancouver series, that he wasn't healthy, and they dropped him in the lineup and then eventually pulled him from the lineup entirely, because when they were going well in that series against Vancouver, that second line with Draisaitl wasn't really doing anything. They were getting killed defensively. As great as Leon is, he's not a defensive stalwart. Kane is not giving you anything defensively. So the Oilers need injury luck to be on their side, but I think that's true of every team.
Yeah, no question about that. Let's talk about some of the new faces that this team has and how they're going to impact the lineup.
So you've got Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson coming in. Arvidsson's on a 2-year deal. Skinner's on a 1-year deal. Both very clear. They want to get they want a chance to win a Stanley Cup while also being able to get some value in the marketplace. You know, Arvidsson's coming off of a serious back injury where he only played 15 games last year, and Skinner's coming off of being bought out. And the logic being, if you're Skinner, I ride shotgun with Draisaitl or McDavid. I get 25 or 30 goals. I can get one last good contract in the NHL before I hang it up. Victor Arvidsson, I need to prove I can stay healthy for a full season, have production to get a long-term contract. And then on the back end, they have a lot of questions. You lose a Cody Ceci, you lose a Philip Broberg, you have to trade some guys, and your options on that right side, they're scary outright. I've been talking about it pretty much the entire summer on Locked On Oilers of the defense is going to be what defines this season. You take Ceci out for Ty Emberson. In theory, good idea, but Ty Emberson has 30 career games of NHL experience, and you're asking him to ride shotgun with Darnell Nurse, which are going to be the most difficult minutes against other teams' best forwards. And then that third pair, I still don't know who's going to end up playing with Brett Kulak. It could be Troy Stecher. It could be Ty Emberson after all, and he moves down and Stecher goes up. It could be Joshua Brown. It could be Travis Dermott, who they brought in on a PTO. They have a lot of candidates for that spot, and nobody's really pulling away yet. It seems early on, it seems like it's going to be Josh Brown because he's played penalty kill before, and they don't really want to put Stecher or Dermott on the penalty kill, and that's kind of the direct Vincent Desharnais replacement, whereas I still don't feel confident in that back end because none of these guys have big track records. You're talking about Stecher and Brown. They've been fringe 6th or 7th D guys on teams like Arizona and Detroit, which don't inspire a ton of confidence. If you can't crack those teams' top 6, you're going to be in the top 6 for a team that is trying to win the Stanley Cup. The defense will be the defining unit for the Oilers this year.
You mentioned the defense. Let's talk about reasons for concern and reasons for optimism. I'm assuming that the blue line is the top reason for concern.
Absolutely. We just talked about Nurse being injured. If Nurse gets knocked out, then you're talking about Dermott, Stecher, Emberson, and none of those guys should be playing on a second pair without somebody who has experience. And as good as Ekholm and Bouchard are together, there's a real argument you might be better off splitting them up at least early in the season to kind of distribute that risk a little more evenly throughout the lineup. Because if you have the best first pair in hockey, that's great. But you go to that second and third pair and you're losing those minutes consistently, it starts to accumulate over the course of the season. As far as optimism, I mean, this is the deepest forward group McDavid and Draisaitl have ever had. You can go player by player. And last year was the first time in their respective careers they were in each other's most common line mate. Now you have even more forward depth than you had last year. You have a real good number 3 center in Adam Henrique who can kill penalties as well. You have Nuge who can still play anywhere. You drop into possession analytic darlings like Skinner and Arvidsson to ride shotgun with Draisaitl, who should make his work a little bit easier. And then the last thing, and I talked about this on the Thursday episode of Locked On Oilers, was Stuart Skinner finally seems to have some confidence in his own game, especially based on the way the playoffs went. I know he did end up getting benched for one game in that Vancouver series, but after that, when he came back in that series, he outplayed Shelovs, he outplayed Jake Ottinger in the conference finals, and he was not the reason they lost to the Panthers. I vehemently disagree with anybody who puts it on Skinner alone, because ultimately it was defensive issues. And that's the reason this is so concerning, that they were undone by their defense. And on paper, their defense is worse than it was last year. And now we're going to try and do it again.
Well, you got until the trade deadline to figure out, exactly who's going to be there come the playoff run. Nick, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
So the Locked On Oilers, all the major podcasting platforms and on YouTube. And then my Twitter handle is just my name, at Nick Zararis. Same thing with Instagram, Nick Zararis, Nick Zararis. Thanks for having me, Gil.
Hey, thanks for being here, Nick. Always a pleasure. All right, I want to thank my guest, Joe DiBiase of Locked On Sabres, Kyle Sullivan of Locked On Avalanche, and of course, Nick Zararis of Locked On Oilers for joining me today. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of Locked On NHL, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Don't forget, we are here at Locked On NHL every Monday through Friday, bringing you the biggest stories from around the National Hockey League. I want to thank everyone for making Locked On NHL your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On NHL Prospects, where you can find the latest updates on future NHL stars today. Find Locked On NHL Prospects on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL Podcast.